In the first days of May 1945, Europe felt like a continent holding its breath. The thunder of aircraft, which had echoed across the skies for 6 long years, slowly faded. Germany was collapsing from within. Town after town surrendered, armored columns abandoned roads, and the once feared Luftwaffe simply stopped. There was no dramatic final battle in the air, no last stand of fighter squadrons. The end came quietly and almost overnight. Across Germany, airfields that had once been busy with mechanics, pilots, and roaring engines now lay strangely still. Some planes stood neatly parked in rows, as if waiting for orders that would never come. Others were damaged or half-assembled, left behind by crews who had no fuel, no parts, and no hope of flying them again. A force that had once promised dominance in Europe was now a scattered collection of silent machines. Fuel shortages had choked the Luftwaffe months earlier. Pilots sat idle while engineers desperately tried to keep aircraft operational with whatever scraps remained. The destruction of rail lines meant engines, tires, and spare parts often never reached their destinations. By late April, even elite units were grounded, fighters were hidden in forests, under camouflage nets, or pushed into barns. Aircraft that might have changed the direction of air warfare, jets, rocket-powered interceptors, advanced prototypes, were frozen in place, victims of a war Germany could no longer sustain. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the surrender became official. But for the Luftwaffe, the collapse had already happened. Aircraft across Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Norway sat abandoned like relics on display. Airfields in Flensburg and Lübeck were filled with everything from worn-out fighters to unfinished jet bombers. Prague's hangars were stuffed with Messerschmitts, Heinkels, and experimental airframes that had never seen combat. At the Rechlin Testing Center, Allied soldiers walked into a treasure room of German aerospace research, wind tunnel models, prototypes, engines, and thousands of documents that showed just how far German engineers had pushed aviation technology. The machines left behind. The sheer variety of aircraft surprised even the most experienced Allied officers. They found the familiar war machines of the early and mid-war years, the Bf 109, the Fw 190, and the He 111, but also the daring innovations Germany had rushed into production during its final desperate months. Sleek Me-262 jet fighters sat beside unusual experimental designs like the forward-swept-wing Junkers Ju-287. The streamlined Arado Ar 234 jet bomber, the world's first operational jet bomber, rested quietly on many runways. Small, lightweight Heinkel He 162 jets, assembled in the last weeks of the war, were left scattered inside factories and supply depots. Transport aircraft, reconnaissance planes, trainers, and even gliders waited silently in place. The Luftwaffe's inventory had once stretched across Europe, now it sat in ruins, trapped between an air force's ambition and the reality of total defeat. As Allied soldiers walked through hangars, they found scenes that felt almost frozen in time. Tools lay on the floor where mechanics had dropped them. Fuel hoses were still attached to empty trucks. Half-painted insignias marked aircraft that had been camouflaged in a hurry. Some jets had been hidden under trees, pointed toward makeshift dirt runways in case a last-minute flight became necessary. But there would be no last flight. Chaos in command. The Luftwaffe's command structure had dissolved even before the surrender. Officers had lost communication with headquarters. Pilots fled from advancing armies or surrendered to whoever arrived first, whether British, American, or Soviet. Maintenance staff often abandoned their posts without orders, trying to reach their homes before the front line swallowed them. Records disappeared as well. Logbooks were burned, fuel papers lost, and inventory sheets left unfinished. Many depots were looted by civilians desperate for metal or goods. The Allies understood how dangerous a few operational aircraft could still be, especially if used by fleeing Nazi officials. So their first directive was simple and absolute. No German aircraft could fly for any reason. No German pilot could take to the sky without Allied approval. This ban was enforced immediately. Guard posts were placed around major airfields. Aircraft were inspected, sealed, or disabled. Watchtowers were built around some of the largest bases to prevent unauthorized takeoffs. For the first time since the 1930s, the Luftwaffe's skies were empty. A race begins, the Allies close in. Even before the surrender was fully complete, Allied intelligence teams were already preparing to move. Germany's advanced aircraft had been feared for years, especially its jets and rocket-powered machines. If they fell into the wrong hands, or remained hidden, they could pose a risk or give rival nations a major technological advantage. Thus began a race, quiet, urgent, and intensely competitive. The Americans moved first with Operation LUSTY, a massive effort to capture Germany's best aircraft and engineers. Colonel Harold Watson and his teams traveled quickly across Germany and into Austria and Czechoslovakia. Their job was to locate advanced technology before anyone else did. When they arrived at airfields such as Lechfeld, they found entire squadrons of Me-262s, some ready to fly, others needing only minor repairs. The Americans were astonished by their speed and potential. The British launched Operation Surgeon, an equally ambitious mission focused not just on planes, but on the minds behind them. British teams searched for designers, engineers, and technicians who understood Germany's advanced jet research. Many of these experts were interviewed, and some were later brought to Britain to continue aviation development. Meanwhile, Soviet trophy brigades swept through eastern and central Germany. They seized factories, blueprints, engines, and aircraft. Whole production lines, like the Bf 109 assembly plants in Moravia, were dismantled and loaded onto trains bound for the Soviet Union. Sometimes American and Soviet units arrived at the same airfield within hours of each other. Arguments broke out. Each side wanted the rarest prototypes, the completed jets, the newest engines, the most advanced designs. Even as the war ended, a new tension was beginning, the early shadow of the Cold War. The value of German knowledge. German mechanics, engineers, and surviving pilots became valuable sources of information. Some worked willingly, hoping for better treatment. Others cooperated because they had no choice. Their expertise helped Allied teams understand complicated systems like the Jumo 004 jet engine, which was advanced but fragile, or the BMW 003, a lighter jet engine used in several late-war projects. These experts explained fuel mixtures, flight behaviors, weaknesses, and required maintenance routines. They helped test pilots and engineers operate aircraft that were far ahead of anything used by the Allies during most of the war. Their information shaped the direction of early post-war aviation. By the end of 1946, the most valuable German aircraft had been removed from Europe. Nearly everything useful had been catalogued, photographed, copied, or shipped abroad. What came next was destruction. In the days immediately after the German surrender, American intelligence teams wasted no time. Operation LUSTY had been planned during the war, but now it expanded with a new urgency. The United States understood that German aviation was years ahead in some areas, especially jet propulsion, rocket-powered flight, and high-speed aerodynamics. Capturing this technology could shape the next generation of American aircraft. Colonel Harold Watson divided his men into multiple groups. Some teams secured airfields, others seized documents, and a few specialized pilot groups prepared to fly any aircraft still capable of taking off. These pilots were extremely skilled. Many had flown experimental American jets and were familiar with dangerous flight conditions. But even they were surprised by the performance of aircraft like the Me-262. At Lechfeld, one of the Luftwaffe's most important jet bases, the Americans found dozens of Me-262s, some fully armed, others stripped for parts. There were also twin-engine Arado jets, glider-like rocket interceptors, and unique late-war prototypes. Watson's whizzers, his elite test pilots, began restoring a handful of jets immediately. It was a risky mission. Many of the aircraft had unknown mechanical problems, hidden sabotage, or missing fuel systems. But the Americans were determined. They flew captured jets carefully across Europe to staging points, then shipped them to the United States. Some were dismantled and loaded onto ships, others were flown to bases under American control before being transported. By the end of the operation, the United States had collected dozens of Me-262 jet fighters, Arado Ar 234 jet bombers, Several He-162 light jets. Captured rocket interceptors. Engines, blueprints and technical reports. Wind tunnel models and advanced aerodynamics research. Many of these machines later influenced American aircraft such as the F-86 Sabre, early rocket planes, and high-speed research programs that shaped the jet age. Britain hunts the minds behind the machines. While the Americans focused heavily on hardware, the British approach was slightly different. Under Operation Surgeon, British teams went after both machines and the people who built them. They understood something important. Aircraft could be destroyed, but knowledge inside an engineer's mind could not be replaced. British intelligence officers moved quickly into northern Germany, where many important aviation experts had taken refuge. At facilities in Schleswig and Husum, teams interviewed engineers who had worked on jet engines like the BMW 003 and Jumo 004, as well as advanced aircraft designs such as the TAR-183, the theoretical precursor to many post-war swept-wing jets. The British brought many aircraft back to RAF Farnborough, a centre for testing foreign technology. There, test pilots flew captured Me-262s and He-162s, pushing them to understand their limits. They discovered that the Me-262 was extremely fast in level flight but had long takeoff runs and fragile engines. They learned how the He-162, built in a hurry by inexperienced German laborers, could be both clever in design and dangerously unreliable. More importantly, British engineers used German research data to accelerate their own jet programs. Projects like the Gloucester Meteor and later Hawker aircraft benefited from insights gained through German materials. The Soviets take factories and entire production lines. If the Americans and British were systematic, the Soviets were thorough on an industrial scale. Their trophy brigades did not just collect a few aircraft, they seized entire factories. In regions such as Saxony, Thuringia, and Silesia, Soviet teams entered production centers and took everything. Aircraft still on assembly lines. Tooling machines and metal presses. Crates of spare parts. Blueprints and technical archives. Teams of German engineers and machinists. The Ovia factory in Prague, one of the largest aircraft production sites in Europe, fell under Soviet control. There, unfinished Bf-109s were completed and later became Czechoslovak aircraft. In Moravia, entire Bf-109 production lines were taken apart and moved east by train. The Soviets also captured several Me-262 jets and Ar-234 bombers. At test centers near Moscow and Leningrad, Soviet pilots examined these machines closely. The knowledge they gained influenced early Soviet jets such as the MiG-9 and MiG-15. Allied rivalry, a new tension begins. The war had ended, but a new competition had begun. American, British, and Soviet teams sometimes arrived at the same facilities within hours of each other. Arguments were common. In some cases, officers negotiated, in others, they simply took what they could before the other side arrived. At one airfield, British forces claimed a group of Me-262s, only to have American officers insist that they had priority because their units had reached the field first. At another site, Soviet troops blocked American investigators from accessing hangars until their trophy teams had removed the most valuable equipment. This rivalry foreshadowed the Cold War, an era in which technology, science, and military capability would become key points of global conflict. German specialists, partners, prisoners, or somewhere in between. Throughout this process, German engineers, pilots, and mechanics played a complicated role. Many cooperated willingly, seeing collaboration as a way to secure better treatment or avoid prosecution. Others were forced to help under military supervision. And some, desperate for survival, offered their knowledge to whichever Allied group reached them first. These individuals explained how to start jet engines that were notoriously fragile, sometimes burning out after just a few hours of flight. They taught Allied teams about new alloys, turbine blade designs, and aerodynamic innovations. Without their assistance, many aircraft would have been impossible to operate safely. In some cases, engineers were recruited for long-term work. Britain brought experts to its research centers. The Soviet Union took entire engineering teams east. The United States would soon begin Operation Paperclip, bringing German scientists across the Atlantic, not just aviation experts, but rocket scientists as well. The turning point: what to keep, what to destroy. By late 1946, the Allies had taken everything of clear value. The United States had its jets and documents. Britain had secured key experts. The Soviets had captured vast industrial assets and machinery. What remained were thousands of aircraft still scattered across Europe. Many were old, worn out, or damaged. Others were still dangerous, especially those fitted with unstable fuels or experimental engines. The Allied Control Council now faced a new question: what should be preserved, and what should be erased forever? The answer would reshape aviation history. A sky that would never rise again. By late 1946, the major powers had taken what they wanted: jets, prototypes, engines, documents, engineers, and entire factories. Now thousands of remaining German aircraft still sat across Europe, on runways, inside barns, in hangars, and even hidden in forests. Some were complete, others were missing wings, engines, or instruments. A few had been stripped bare by locals searching for anything useful. The Allies now faced a new task: the complete demilitarization of German aviation. The world had just survived a devastating war. No Allied government wanted Germany to be capable of building a new air force anytime soon. And so, decisions were made at the highest levels. Every remaining Luftwaffe aircraft would be destroyed, unless specifically saved for research or museum preservation. This order triggered one of the largest scrapping operations in aviation history, turning airfields into scrap yards. Across Germany, Austria, Denmark, Norway, and the Czech lands, Allied teams set up destruction centers. Airfields that had once echoed with engine tests and pilot briefings now became industrial graveyards. Bases such as Flensburg, Lübeck-Blankensee, Grove, Denmark, Fassberg, and Tarnowitz were among the largest scrapping hubs. Here, German aircraft were dragged into long lines, inspected one final time, and then dismantled with ruthless efficiency. The process usually followed a pattern. Remove anything useful. Instruments, radios, machine guns, and engines were taken out first. Some were tested, others were shipped for scrap metal. Drain and neutralize fuel. Jet fuel, gasoline, and chemical mixtures had to be handled carefully. Several fires occurred when inexperienced workers tried to destroy aircraft too quickly. Cut the wings. Wings were removed with saws or pulled off using cranes and chains. Crush the fuselage. Giant rollers or heavy tanks drove over the airframes, flattening them into sheets of aluminum. Collect and melt. The metal was sorted and sent to foundries to be melted into raw materials. The destruction was not done out of hatred or revenge. It was practical and political. Europe needed aluminum, steel, copper, and other metals for rebuilding bridges, factories, railways, and houses. Destroying the Luftwaffe helped restart the continent's economy. For local workers, this became a source of income in an otherwise hopeless time. Many men and women who had lost their homes or jobs now found work cutting apart the very machines that had once symbolized German military power. Row after row, a forest of broken wings. Eyewitnesses described the scenes with a mix of sadness and disbelief. At some airfields, hundreds of fighters were parked wingtip to wingtip, Bf-109s, Fw-190s, Ju-88s, as if waiting for their final inspection. Jets like the Me-262 and He-162 stood among them, their sleek forms hinting at a future they would never fully explore. Many Allied soldiers felt it was a shame to destroy so many advanced machines. But orders were orders. The world was nervous, suspicious, and afraid of another conflict rising from the ashes. The safest path was destruction. Planes were not simply scrapped, some were burned in massive pits, while others were towed to beaches and sunk at sea. Along certain coastlines, especially in Denmark and northern Germany, barges filled with Luftwaffe aircraft were dragged into deep water and scuttled. Many of those wrecks still rest on the seabed today. In some cases, local civilians tried to save small pieces, a control stick, a nameplate, or a wing panel. Children collected cockpit instruments as toys. Farmers used aircraft wheels on wagons. A few turned aircraft skins into roofing metal. But the airframes themselves could not be saved. Germany's aviation legacy was being erased, deliberately and completely. Civil aircraft, a more complicated fate. Not all Luftwaffe aircraft were purely military. The Junkers Ju-52, for example, had been a civilian airliner before the war and continued to have commercial value. But Allied policy was strict. Germany could not keep any aircraft capable of military use. Some Ju-52s were allowed to survive temporarily for essential services such as humanitarian flights or transport missions. Others were given to nations in need of aircraft. A few were rebuilt in France under the name Amiot AAC.1 Toucan, serving in French colonies for years. But even these useful transports were eventually scrapped or replaced by modern Allied-built aircraft. Czechoslovakia faced a similar dilemma. Their factories contained large numbers of German aircraft in various stages of assembly. For a short time, they finished building these planes, giving them new names. But by the late 1940s, even these were considered politically sensitive and technologically outdated. Most were retired and dismantled. France also used German trainers and fighters for several years, but maintenance became nearly impossible. Without spare parts, aircraft were grounded, stripped, and destroyed. By 1950, German aircraft were almost entirely extinct across Europe. Historians still ask, could more have been saved? Looking back, many aviation historians feel a sense of loss. Germany had produced some of the most innovative aircraft of the era. Prototypes like the Ju-287, Ta-183, Ho-229 Flying Wing, and Me-264 long-range bomber existed in only a handful of examples. Almost all were destroyed. Museums at the time simply did not have the space, funding, or interest in preserving such a massive collection. The priority was peace, stability, and disarmament, not historical value. Some argue that dozens of irreplaceable aircraft were lost because no one imagined how historically important they would become. Others believe that the destruction was necessary to prevent Germany from rebuilding its air force. What is undeniable is that today's surviving Luftwaffe aircraft, just a few dozen worldwide, represent a tiny fragment of what once existed. Recycling war into peace. Europe in 1945–48 was starving for resources. Entire cities had been destroyed. Industrial production was at its lowest point in decades. Metal recycling was not just useful, it was essential. The aluminum from thousands of scrapped aircraft became pots and pans for households, window frames, machine parts, electrical components, construction materials, railway equipment. Steel went into rebuilding bridges, factories, and vehicles. Copper wiring from aircraft instruments helped restore electricity networks. In a way, the Luftwaffe unintentionally contributed to rebuilding the homes and cities it had once helped destroy. By 1948, the Luftwaffe was gone. The destruction was nearly total. Airfields that had once hosted hundreds of fighters were empty. Runways were cracked or torn up. Hangars were converted into storage buildings or abandoned. Some airbases became Allied training grounds, displaced person shelters, farmland, civilian airports, industrial zones. The war had ended, and with it, the Luftwaffe's presence faded completely from the European landscape. Germany would not have a new air force until 1956, and when it did, it flew entirely with Allied-built aircraft. The age of German wartime aviation had ended. The planes that escaped destruction. Even though most Luftwaffe aircraft were destroyed between 1945 and 1948, a small number managed to avoid the scrapyard and entered a second life. Their survival was not planned, it was a mixture of luck, timing, and necessity. In the ruins of post-war Europe, several nations needed aircraft quickly. They had no money for new planes, no factories ready to operate, and no easy access to Allied surplus machines. For these countries, German aircraft, already on their airfields, were the only available option. Thus began an unlikely chapter. German fighters flying under foreign flags long after World War II. Czechoslovakia, the Ovier S-199, a difficult inheritance. One of the most famous post-war German aircraft stories took place in Czechoslovakia. When the war ended, Czech factories contained dozens of airframes, engines, and parts, especially from the Bf-109 fighter. These were leftovers from German occupation when Czech industry was forced to build aircraft for the Luftwaffe. Rather than waste these materials, Czech engineers finished the aircraft themselves. But there was a problem: they lacked the original Daimler-Benz engines. Instead, they installed surplus Junkers engines that were never meant for the 109's airframe. The result was a new aircraft, the Ovier S-199. It looked like a Bf-109, but flew very differently. Pilots found it difficult, unstable, and sometimes dangerous. Yet it became the backbone of the new Czechoslovak Air Force in 1946 to 1947. The story didn't end there. In 1948, when the newly formed State of Israel desperately needed fighter aircraft, Czechoslovakia sold several S-199s to them. These aircraft became Israel's first fighters and fought in the country's War of Independence. For a brief moment in history, the descendants of German World War II fighters helped defend a newborn nation, a strange twist no one could have imagined. Spain, a legacy that lasted into the 1960s. Spain had been building the Bf-109 under license since the late 1930s. After the war, they continued production using whatever parts remained. Their version was called the Hispano-Aviation HA-1112. Because Germany was no longer producing engines, Spain installed British Rolls-Royce engines instead. The result was a unique hybrid: German airframe, British powerplant, Spanish craftsmanship. These aircraft served the Spanish Air Force until the mid-1950s and remained operational long enough to appear decades later in films such as The Battle of Britain, where they famously portrayed German fighters. Ironically, the sight of Bf-109s flying in movies today is usually footage of Spanish HA-1112s, not German originals. Norway, a practical reuse. After the war, Norway ended up with several captured aircraft on its territory, including Bf-109s and Arado 96 trainers. Norway had no modern aircraft of its own and needed equipment urgently. For practical reasons, they used these captured planes for training and patrol flights. But spare parts soon ran out, and by the early 1950s, Norway phased out all German equipment. Several of these aircraft were stored long enough to be rediscovered by aviation historians decades later. A few eventually reached museums and restoration groups. France, a country of rebuilders. France had a unique position. It retained a significant amount of German equipment and factories. French engineers studied and reused many German designs for several years after the war. The best example is the Junkers Ju-52, which France produced under the name Toucan. The French Toucans served in colonial air operations in Africa and Indochina. Their rugged design made them helpful in remote regions where no other transport aircraft could reliably operate. By the early 1950s, France had modernized its air fleet and retired most German designs. Many were scrapped, but a few survived long enough to become museum exhibits. West Germany, a new air force without the past. When West Germany joined NATO in 1955 and formed the new Bundesluftwaffe in 1956, it made a clear decision. No World War II aircraft would return to service. Instead, the new German Air Force adopted Allied-built jets such as Republic F-84 Thunderstreak, Canadair CL-13 Sabre, Lockheed F-10 for Starfighter. The Luftwaffe wanted a clean break from the past. German aviation had entered the jet age, and the old wartime designs were left behind. By the 1960s, almost no original Luftwaffe aircraft remained anywhere in Germany. The search for lost aircraft begins. As Europe recovered and the Cold War settled into place, interest in World War II history slowly grew. Veterans, historians, and aviation enthusiasts began searching for surviving aircraft. What they discovered was sobering. Almost nothing had survived. To find even a single original Luftwaffe aircraft, people had to explore crash sites in forests, mountain lakes, deep swamps, Arctic regions, forgotten hangars in remote villages. Some aircraft were buried intentionally to hide them from advancing armies. Others had crashed in remote places where no one had bothered to recover them. Many had decayed, but a few were in surprisingly good condition. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, daring recovery teams found enough pieces to rebuild a handful of aircraft for museums. But most restorations required combining parts from many different wrecks. And Me 109 on display today might be built from 5 or 6 different aircraft. AFW 190 might include pieces found in 3 countries. It was like assembling historical puzzles from fragments scattered across Europe. Replicas and reproductions, a new beginning. Because so few original airframes survived, the 1990s and 2000s saw a new trend. Building replicas of famous Luftwaffe aircraft. Some companies produced flyable reproductions of Me 262 jet fighters, FW 190 radial engine fighters, Bf 109 variants. These replicas used modern materials and safer engines but kept the original look and aerodynamic design. A few fly at airshows today, giving audiences a rare glimpse of the aircraft that once dominated European skies. Though they aren't originals, they keep the history alive. The legacy of a lost air force. The Luftwaffe's wartime fleet once filled hundreds of airfields. Tens of thousands of aircraft served between 1939 and 1945. But today, fewer than 100 original German World War II aircraft exist in museums worldwide. Many are incomplete or heavily restored. Why so few? Because the Allies made a clear decision in the late 1940s. Germany would not rise again through the power of the air. Its aviation past would be dismantled, physically, politically, and symbolically. The few surviving machines, scattered across museums in Washington, London, Munich, Ottawa, Krakow, and other cities, serve as reminders of a vanished age. They show how quickly a mighty air force can disappear. How technology can be lost as fast as it is created. How political decisions can erase almost an entire era of engineering. A silent legacy. Today, when people look at the last surviving Me 262s, Bf 109s, FW 190s, or Arado jets, they often don't realize how close these aircraft came to disappearing completely. They are not just machines. They are time capsules. They are fragments of a world that no longer exists. They are symbols of a nation's ambition, tragedy, and collapse. The handful of aircraft that survived the storm. And they remind us that history is fragile. Thousands of aircraft once roared across Europe. Now only a few remain, silent, motionless, preserved behind ropes and glass. The Luftwaffe vanished faster than it rose. Its destruction reshaped aviation, politics, and the world's understanding of air power. Its legacy lives on in the jets that followed, American, British, Soviet, and in the stories told by